Okay, well, I think we can get started. It's 7:31. We might have a few more people coming in. So thank you so much, everybody, for joining us tonight for our session on what you need to know about college admissions in 2022. My name is Joan Casey, and I'm the founder of Educational Advocates College Consultant. We've been in practice for 18 years, and we love working with students and families, guiding them through the college admissions process, including financial aid and helping different kinds of students with different interests and looking at a wide range of colleges across the United States and sometimes even out of the country. And we, hope today to help you understand some of the intricacies of the college admissions office enrollment management and, some of the things that mystify families. We hope we give some clarity to that tonight. So I'm going to have Laurel introduce herself, and then we'll take it away.
Hi, everyone. My name is Laurel Ware. It's great to see some familiar names on the list. So thank you all so much for joining us. I've been working with students for about a decade now. I started out in schools. I worked in a couple different schools in Baltimore as a teacher, college counselor, coach, you name it, I did it. And then I moved down to Florida with my husband and took a job in the University of Florida admissions office for a couple of years, which was very interesting and instructive. And now I'm delighted to be back on the student side and working with Joan. All right, let's get rolling. Okay, so we're going to start out by talking a little bit about the holistic review process. So this is probably a term that you've heard before. Most colleges use some sort of holistic review, especially the kinds of colleges that our students tend to apply to. And what it basically is it's a way to get to know a student beyond just test scores and grades. And obviously, academic achievement is a very important part of the college application process, but they want to know more about what a student is bringing. So, they want to consider factors like background, demographic information, activities that were done in high school and might give them a clue as to what a student would be involved in college. Of course, the personal statement or the Common App essay is very, very important. Recommendations are important. And of course, additional information, if it's allowed to be submitted. Not all schools will accept additional information, but some will accept things like portfolios, some offer interviews, etc. And as I said, this really helps the colleges to build these pictures of these students as people, not as just test scores and grades, just a sheet of numbers. But there's a major limitation in this process, which is that it takes a ton of time. And as I can tell you from coming from a very high volume admissions office, we were getting about 60,000 applications. We read every single application more than once. So it takes an enormous amount of time. And when you're having to move quite quickly, it can mean that you're taking some shortcuts to try and figure out very quickly if a student is admissible or not. So some of the tools of the trade, many colleges use Slate, which is a customer relationship management or CRM program. And this allows them to track students from all, through all stages of the process, from the time before when students are prospects, so they might be interested in applying, through when they, get to know about the college, they apply, and then hopefully will matriculate. Slate, it provides so much data. It is just an intense system that collects all of these different data points about students, and including things like their interactions with the college, which we'll talk a little bit more about. But I just wanted to show you some examples of what the Slate system looks like, so you kind of have an idea of what admissions officers are using when they're reviewing applications. So this is an example that was just taken from the Slate demo website. This is publicly available. I'm not sharing anything that's proprietary, but it just shows kind of what the dashboard page of a Slate profile looks like. So you can see there's a flag at the top for this student that says related to a Board of Trustees member. That's not something that we ever used at the University of Florida, but it is, there are tags that alert an admissions officer to the fact that a student might be a legacy or an athlete or a scholarship student. And certainly those are, that's a consideration in the process. Here you can see the biographic information. So, that's where if race or ethnicity is going to be factored into the admissions decision, that might be something that the admissions officer is thinking about. Here you're seeing the way that the application is being reviewed. So at the front, you can see that they're awaiting submission, payment, materials. Right now, in the dark blue, this application is in the first read. So there are going to be multiple people who read the application, and it's in first read. And then you can see where it will be tracked through the rest of the process through the committee review, where multiple people would decide, is this person admissible or not? And then the decision would ultimately be made and released. The dots here are the activity history, which I'll show you a little bit more about in a minute, but it basically is showing the admissions officer how frequently is this person interacting with the college. And each color has a different meaning, but they're looking at, is the student visiting our website? Are they opening our emails? Are they coming to campus? Are they participating in online information sessions? All these data points will be considered when they're thinking about how interested is this student in our school, because obviously they want to be admitting students who are interested in attending that university. If you have a question, feel free to put it in the chat and we will get to it as soon as we can. Here on the side, you can see the status history. So this student, it's a little backwards. I don't know why you have to become a prospect and then an applicant and then an inquiry. But again, thinking about tracking them through the process. And finally, you can see down here the origin. So this student was purchased. So, colleges will buy lists of names from the ACT, SAT, and they will send mailings to students based on certain criteria. So they want every student who is above a 1320 on this particular test. But the thing is, of course, students whose name is just being bought and then they're getting unsolicited information, they're probably not as interested as a student who first initiated contact with the college by coming to campus to do an information session or something. So that's something colleges are thinking about. What does that tell us about how you might, how likely you might be to come to our school? So this is just a quick shot of what the communications portal looks like in Slate. So it'll show you information about, again, what emails the student has received, whether they opened it. So at the top, you can see it was a sent message. Sorry, it's a little blurry, but it says sent message. But if it had been opened, you would see how many times the student had opened it. You could see if they clicked on links. Every time that the student was on the website, you can see a little thing that says ping. So that's, tracking with cookies so they can know where was the student going, what were they looking at, how long were they there. And so there are, all these data points that are being collected about students, and some are very obvious and some are less obvious, but they are all considered as part of the admissions process. Another tool that colleges will use when they're thinking about an applicant is called the landscape score. So not every school uses this, but many do. It's put out by the College Board, of course, SAT and AP folks. And so what it does is it provides aggregate information about students, and it looks at a number of data points. It looks at things about their high school, how many students are taking the SAT or the ACT at that school, how many students are taking APs, what the average score is, whether a majority of students are on free and reduced lunch, what the average income of that zip code is. So all of these different data points, and they use this to compile what's called an adversity score. There was some hubbub about this when it came out, but the idea basically is they want to try and give a quantitative value of how much adversity did this student face in terms of their high school experience. And so obviously, as we're looking at that score, if you see a student who might be a little bit lower in the test score profile, but has challenged themselves as much as is possible as at that school, and they're coming from a very high adversity background, that might be weighted a little bit differently than a student who's coming from a very low adversity background. And again, this is based on aggregate data, so it's possible that a student is not getting a completely accurate picture for their personal circumstances, but it's just another tool that colleges are trying to use to make sure that they're giving as much thought to the process of who these students are in their backgrounds and what they're bringing to the campus, aside from just the basic information in the application. All right, so other factors that are considered to shape a class are things like gender, geographic diversity, unique talents, athletic abilities, and potentially race and ethnicity, although that depends on the institution. And there are some court cases going on right now that you may have heard of that could potentially change that, but right now there are some schools that use race and ethnicity. So on the left here, I just picked an example. So Caltech, and I wanted to really highlight the difference in gender and how that plays a role in their admissions process. As you can see, about 3 out of 4 students who are applying to Caltech are male, but they're admitting almost half and half. And so that just really shows us that when they're making their admissions decision, they're really thinking about wanting to have a very, as balanced a class as possible. So they're not just admitting based on who's applying, they're actually admitting based on the class that they want to have. And that means, of course, that the admission rate between males and females is pretty different. Now, we're talking still about, barely double digits. So it's not like this is going to be a complete game changer, but if you are a woman applying to Caltech, you have a statistically better chance of being admitted than a man, just because of who's applying and what they're looking for in terms of shaping their class. I also wanted to give an example of geographic diversity. So these are two, Loyola University Maryland and St. Bonaventure University are two pretty similar universities. They're both Jesuit. Loyola is obviously in Maryland, St. Bonaventure is in New York. But you'll notice at the bottom it says student primary residence. So Loyola tends to pull a lot of students from New England, New York, New Jersey. And so they have 70% out-of-state students at their school, which is kind of uncommon for sort of being a regional university. Whereas St. Bonaventure pulls very few students out of state. 80%, almost 80% of their students are coming from in the state of New York. So as you can imagine, if you're a student applying from, Maryland to Loyola, that might actually be more desirable to them than a student applying from New York to St. Bonaventure. So, both of these admit pretty high percentage of students. That may not be a huge driver in their decision, but it is something they're thinking about. Okay, I also want to talk about a little bit of how high school affects consideration. So when colleges are reading applications, they often read in school groups. And what they will do is compare students who are applying from the same school. And I really want to highlight compare. Please don't think of this as a direct competition of where it's a quota of if I get in, my friend can't, or vice versa. But what they are using that to do is really think about, what are the things that students can take at that school? What is the max course load? What is the highest GPA that students are able to apply? Okay, we need to hide this person. And what are students able to do in terms of being at that school? So you can use some resources to really understand what your sort of how you compare to students who are applying from your school. One of the best resources is Naviance or SCORE, the scattergrams. So depending on which system your school uses, you can use Naviance or SCORE, and it'll show you, how do you compare to other students who are applying from your school, and where do you fall within that. You can also ask your college or guidance counselor, and just be very honest. You're not looking for, how do I compare to this exact person, but just, how does your schedule compare to what the average student who's applying to X university takes from your school? And then you can also look at the school profile. I think it's a really good idea for every student to read, and parents as well, to read the school profile and understand, what information is the school giving to the college, because this is usually a 2 to 3 page document that colleges send with every application, and the purpose of it is to give a very quick rundown of what that school offers, what the typical scores are, things like that. And so it's really powerful information to make sure you know. But just be aware of comparisons, please, because I cannot tell you the number of times when I was at the University of Florida that I got phone calls from someone saying, oh, why didn't I get in? Because I know my grades and test scores are better than this other person who got in from my school. And it's a very frustrating conversation to have, because only the college really knows what the information is that's contained in that application. And so you never know what was important in that decision and what made the difference. And so just try to, even if you know somebody else's test scores or grades, please try not to, decide that there was an unfair advantage being had. Just give them the benefit of the doubt. All right, should we take questions now or at the end, Joan?
Let's see. I think we should wait till the end, because I think we might answer people's questions, and I just want to make sure we get everything across. So if you wouldn't mind waiting and holding your questions till the end, that would be great. If anyone has to leave early and can't wait till the question and answer period, feel free to email either one of us, and you can go to our website, educationaladvocates.com.
I can also answer some stuff in the chat while Joan's talking.
Yeah, if anyone wants to put it in the chat, that's what I've been doing too. So now we move on to the impact of test optional policies in changing demographics. So we had March 2020 is when COVID hit. Of course, for that year, students were hearing their admissions decision that very month. So it was the juniors that year that were really impacted, because it's very common for students to take their first standardized tests in the spring. So you can see for those students it was 78% submitting test scores in our country the year before the COVID application year. And then in 2020, it was only 43%, because it was essentially only students that were able to take a SAT or an ACT in the fall of fall of 2020 and, maybe January or February before everything shut down. So there was a 43% of students were, because they couldn't even submit a test. Most of them didn't even have one. And then, we've seen it, creep up a little bit this past year. So part of that was students were able to take tests, but this says to me that a lot of students decided maybe it isn't worth it. And some of that is, when you think about it, if you're only submitting test scores that are strong, what's happened is the test scores have crept up a little bit. So maybe anywhere from 40 to 60 points, it really can vary. So if you're looking, the conventional wisdom is you look at the middle 50% range for the admitted class for a given college. And if you're in that range, you submit. For really selective colleges, it's more like the 50th percentile. And so students would look, and only the stronger students were submitting. So they self-select out, which is the right thing to do. So you might find when you're applying, you might submit your scores to some schools on your list, but not to all of them. So, for this year at least, and actually projected by quite a few schools for the next few years, it seems like test optional policies will continue. There are some colleges that only decide year to year, so we won't know their decision until, probably, a year from now. So, younger students watching this webinar will wait and see. But just some things like the state of Florida, like Laurel worked at University of Florida admissions. It's by state legislature, they never adopted test optional even during COVID. So those tests were always required. The state of Georgia resumed testing this past year. So like Georgia Tech, University of Georgia, all of those publics. And then Auburn and the University of Tennessee system announced the plan to return to testing next year. Georgetown and MIT also have announced plans to return to requiring tests, but most, with a few other exceptions, most other colleges do remain test optional for now, which I think I think it's great. I think it's been a good thing. So one of the things that we would advise is, take a look at the language, of the colleges you're applying to. So, some of them you can tell by reading what they have to say that they care a little bit more about tests still than others do. So if you look at Carleton, I won't read the whole thing, don't worry, but the beginning, it says, the results of standardized exams help the admissions committee judge candidates' academic abilities. So there are a lot of colleges out there that actually don't think that the test scores are all that helpful in judging the students' academic abilities, but Carleton is coming out and saying they do. Now, having said that, we've been on webinars with Carleton this past year, and they definitely did admit students that didn't submit scores, but you can tell that they care about them a little bit more than Wake Forest. So Wake Forest is saying, if you have the scores, feel free to submit them. If you don't like them, don't submit, you won't be penalized. So it's a very different kind of tone than you're seeing from Carleton. So that can be very interesting for students to kind of look at the differences. Now, the bottom line is, you take the test, you do your best. If your scores aren't in range, you don't submit them. Don't beat yourself up about it. It's going to be fine. So on the next slide, continuing, so what happened with test optional? So, applications went up at a number of different schools, particularly the most selective colleges. So, roughly colleges that admit less than 25%. So I think that the thinking was, I'm a great student. I have really, rigorous classes. I've got a great GPA. I'm an interesting person. I take, I have interesting activities. But, in the past, I wouldn't have been able to throw an application into, Colgate or Brown or whatever. But, now I don't have to submit a test. So I'm going to throw my hat in the ring. And I know these colleges are really hard to get into, but I'm just going to see what happens. So that was a lot of the thinking on the part of students. And that was part of the reason that, applications were up at certain schools. But it wasn't just the most selective. I mentioned Colgate. University of California is obviously very selective. Now they're test blind, actually. There was a court case last year, so they won't even look at tests. So you don't even have a chance to submit them there. And that is continuing to be the policy moving forward. You know, applications were also up at places like Northeastern. NYU had over 100,000, so Berkeley over 100,000. You know, MIT had record applications. Some of the, you know, moderately selective but excellent schools like Dickinson College in Pennsylvania, they also had notable increases. And there's not always a rhyme or reason to this. The 2019 Colgate had a 102% increase in applications, and the Colgate admissions office doesn't even know why. So sometimes it's like, it's kind of youth and trends and you know what gets rated top on Unigo, and it's not always predictable. So then there were some colleges that had fewer applications, Tulane and Pitzer being two of them. We could, you know, we have theories about why, but we don't have any hard evidence about the reasons why, so I won't really get into our theories. And or they were steady, like they just remained even, like Bowdoin College in Maine. Then there were a few colleges that had some small decreases. So George Washington University, prior to COVID, had plans to increase enrollment to become a slightly larger school. And then COVID hit. And if you remember, you know, a lot of students took a gap year and decided not to go. And even, you know, there's been a decrease in enrollment in this country in college since COVID. But then like Franklin and Marshall, they dropped merit scholarships. So is that a reason that, you know, they had fewer applications? Hard to know. And then Villanova also had a slight decrease, but this followed like their NCAA basketball championship years where their applications skyrocketed. So it might just be a leveling out. That may be all that is. So one of the things I want to caution is if you're Googling, you know, you might be Googling test optional and you might see charts that show things like percent of students admitted with tests, without tests at a given set of schools. And we purposely did not give you a slide like that because I think that kind of a slide is really misleading. And the reason is when you think about it, lots of students who are in the most rigorous curriculum in their high school and get straight A's probably do pretty well on standardized tests, right? So naturally, you know, they're going to submit tests and they're going to get in. However, there are always students that they might come from, you know, backgrounds of students that don't do as well on standardized testing, but they might be excellent students with great rigor. And, you know, those students did just fine in the college admissions process. They were not necessarily penalized. An interesting data point that I read recently is that even at schools like STEM schools, men submitted test scores at a higher rate than women because they had scored better on the math and the math score was valued more. And, you know, we tend to think, you know, there's more women going to college these days. We tend to think of women as stronger students. But there is a stereotype threat that's been documented of women in math and how some of them, you know, don't perform as well on standardized test scores in math. Of course, that's not everybody. So we don't want to, you know, it goes to what Laura was saying about holistic, like they're really looking at the whole student, not just the test score. And that's definitely the case with Florida and Georgia. I mean, we've heard from Rick Clark, who's the Georgia Tech admissions officer. It's a great blog. If anyone wants to, you probably don't want to subscribe to a college admissions blog, but if you do, his is great. But he definitely has emphasized, like, you know, yeah, you got to send your scores in, it's required, but like that doesn't mean it's going to hurt you if you're the right kid for this school. So I think it's really important to remember that. Okay, and then on the next slide, let's shift a little bit into talking about a little bit more about student demographics, including underrepresented minorities, first generation, and international students. So there's definitely was a downturn the year after COVID among applications among underrepresented minorities and first generation students. And the Common App started to realize it. It was talked about in the college admissions world. And there was like an effort to really reach out to students to get them to apply. So, you know, since 2019, there's been an 18% increase in underrepresented minorities applying to college. And then first generation for the same time period up 22%. And, you know, international students had declined, because of visas related to COVID, but they had actually even declined a little bit before that. Some people say because of the politics in this country. But, now it's going back up again. So there was a 33% increase, and I've listed the countries in particular. One thing that's really fascinating, though, is that overall full-time undergraduate enrollment is down 9.4% since before the pandemic, and that's over 1 million students. Now, some of that could be that students are going part-time, they're going for certificate programs, they're going to work, they're starting business, they're doing a gig economy. But I think the whole COVID year had people taking a second look at college. So on the next slide, I wanted to talk a little bit about the impacts of different demographic groups. So one of the things that when I saw this Pew Research Center report, I thought was really fascinating slide is that for those percent of students that are age 7 to 22, back in 1969, 82% of that age cohort was white, which doesn't surprise anybody. But now you see that for Gen Zers in 2019, just over half, 52% were white. And when you think about the increasing percent of Hispanic people in our country, and you look at like California, Texas, Florida, when you look at the admissions data for schools in those states, it's not uncommon to notice that they're admitting a good portion of the class, who are students of color, and many of them are Hispanic. So, that's been a really interesting thing to see this past year. On the next slide, we just took a sampling of schools so we could see the difference between 2020 and the current year. And a lot of the colleges haven't reported their data out yet, but like Amherst College has had a long-standing commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion. They have had a huge percentage of Pell Grant recipients, that's the grant that goes to the lowest income people in our country, and they've always been really good about providing access. So you can continuing to see them increasing from year to year. BC about even. BU has increased, which is great for them, because I think in the past their diversity has come more from international students. I won't go through, you can read the slide, but you can see that the trend. And now that doesn't mean, if more students are admitted, that of course doesn't mean they're going, right? They might get in. Some of these schools that are really more rural might be really working hard to have a more diverse student body, but that doesn't mean the students that were admitted are going to go. And that's why it's hard for these schools to recruit and create a diverse class. So on the next slide, same thing, first generation, huge increase at Middlebury. You can see there's a little bit of a bump up at Cornell, a slight decline at Pomona, which is like Amherst, has had a long history of commitment to access. So just gives you a little snapshot of these are the kinds of things colleges are thinking about. And so things to take away, just to recap, colleges, not many, not all, some colleges aren't looking at diversity, equity, inclusion at all, but those that are, they're realizing they need to choose a freshman class that looks like the country, whether it's gender or race or ethnicity, they're balancing that with like lots of them are colleges, of course, still pay attention to legacy, to recruited athletes, all of that. So with this increase in application, all of these groups are being squeezed, right? Because these really selective schools are getting so many applications. But as Laurel always likes to say, the students can only go to one school at the end of the day. I already talked about international students, but one additional point on that is, yes, they add to diversity. Lots of, we work with a lot of students from all over the country, but a lot of students, they want to go to a school that's diverse. They want to go to school and meet kids from other countries. They want to meet students from other parts of the country that grew up with different religious backgrounds and so on and so forth. And, we've had a lot of conversations in our country in the past couple of years, and, colleges have listened to that and realized that, they need to pay more attention to access. So on the next slide. So, however, if you look at, the increase in applications by median household income, not surprisingly, it's the wealthiest people in our country, or the children of the wealthiest people in our country, that, are still that are representing, the most applications in our country. And that's a pretty, that's a huge, I mean, even with the, number 4, which is still, a relatively affluent group, there's a huge difference. So it's kind of shocking in many ways. And just to give you a little visual on the increases, the blue is 2020 and the orange is this past year. And so you can see the big difference between, like Berkeley had over 100,000, as I mentioned, NYU had over 100,000. So pretty much every school on this list had an increase this year. Now, we don't want this presentation to be about the Ivy League and about Harvard. And in some of what we're saying, like we are saying like straight A's in rigor, because that's in some ways a really confusing pool. Like, students that have those kind of grades expect to be able to apply anywhere they want, and then they realize like it's more complicated. But we're really showing this slide because it's just a really great illustration of how things change. So the class of 2005, 2006, there were, slightly over 20,000 applications to Harvard, and their admit rate was about 11%. And, now this year, it's like 3.7% or something like that. But take a look at the third bar to the right on the graph, and that is the year after. That's the year before COVID. That's 2020, fall 2020. And you can see in the 2 years what we're talking about, how those applications just spiked right up.
Right, so now we're going to talk about yield and kind of how that plays a role in the admissions process. So this is just a really quick snapshot of what the admissions funnel looks like. So obviously it starts out large with, this is like other funnels that are used in different applications, but it starts out with, all possible students who might be interested in attending that college, and then it gets smaller and smaller until you get down to the those who are accepted and decide to ultimately matriculate. And we just show you this graphic to reinforce that there's a lot more that goes on in the admissions process than just admitting the best students. Colleges are really thinking about a lot of different factors when they're trying to build the class and to build a strong school as a whole. And these are all, there are so many stages of the process that have to be considered as a school gets down to the class that they would like to have for that year. So, when colleges are thinking about yield, they are acting a little bit, they're trying to protect their own interests. And, it is really important because it used to be a factor in rankings and it is not anymore, but it is still some bragging rights. And I think it definitely can factor into the way that people think about the quality of a school, although I would really caution you against using yield as a measure of quality. But the thing is that, as Joan just said, as students apply to more schools, they're still only picking one. So if where 10 years ago it was average, that a student would apply to maybe 5 or 6 schools, now, it's creeping up and creeping up. And I think now the average is 8, and many of our students will apply to 10, 12, maybe even more. And I've heard of students who apply to 20 routinely. In my personal opinion, I think that is too many. I think that if you're applying to that many schools, it means that, we haven't done a good job of figuring out where the priorities are and what's going to be a good match. But, so colleges are very aware of this. Okay, students are applying to more schools. They're still only going to say yes to one. So that means that we have to really work hard to make sure that we can admit enough students to make our class. And they'll use tools like early decision. That's probably the biggest thing that they use to protect their yield, because early decision, it is a guarantee of that student will attend that college if they are admitted. So I always give the metaphor of that early decision is like proposing marriage to a school versus asking it out on a date. So you want to be really careful about where your commitment level is for that school. And they'll also use tools like demonstrated interest, we talked about, and we'll continue to talk about it a little bit more, because they're looking for indications that a student is interested in them and isn't just applying as a safety or to have more options. Sometimes they will deny strong students. So they are schools that we are very aware of who have a history of denying students who they think are just using them as a backup. And that is happening more and more. And so we have to be very aware of making sure that if a student is putting a school on their list because they think that, it will be a good admissions prospect for them, we still need to do the work of showing interest and making sure that they know that, they're not just there as a backup. Of course, schools will also use their wait list to try and protect their yield, and they will use pathway programs too. And pathway programs are programs that are, designed to give them a steady stream of students, but who aren't necessarily counted in their statistics. So for instance, there are some programs where students will go abroad for the first year, or there are programs that have, Florida, there are some limited major programs that are pathway programs, and those are not counted in the school's official admissions statistics. So it can be a little bit of smoke and mirrors going on in terms of trying to admit more students and say they admitted fewer in order to kind of have their cake and eat it too. You will see, that yield has an inverse relationship to how high a school's admit rate is. But again, please don't use it as a measure of quality, because there are many very fine schools that have low yield rates because of all these factors that we've just discussed. So when yield predictions go wrong, it's been interesting for yield, especially over COVID. So you may have heard that BU had, record-breaking applications for a couple of years, and they had way over enrollment, which caused a lot of problems with housing, especially, and some other factors for them. And so that what that means is then that they're going to admit fewer students because they're trying to scale back on their class size. They're trying to make sure that they are not overtaxing themselves in terms of what they can handle in the classrooms and in housing and just across campus. Same thing happened at, many other colleges. Obviously, Harvard is mentioned here, but there are some public schools, University of South Florida, Purdue, Indiana. So they all saw record applications and large classes. And it's very difficult for an admissions director to try and figure out what is our yield going to be. They use a lot of data points to make an educated guess. But we talked about Colgate earlier. But ultimately, what happens is if more students say yes to the offer than they think, then they can't take it back. They can't say, oh, actually, and actually, the last example here, FSU, they kind of tried to take it back a little bit. They had a way over yield in the COVID year, and they were super harsh with their deadlines. If you didn't deposit on the minute by the deadline, they were taking those offers back. They were doing everything they could to try and make sure that they didn't end up with too many students. So there is too much of a good thing. And like I said, that will then have a knock-on effect, because colleges are thinking about, okay, we need to manage these students. We need to make sure they're still having a good, good experience, because retention is a huge factor in admissions as well. They're thinking not only about the students that we admit, but how do we keep these students and make sure that they're happy here and that they're finishing on time. Graduation rate, retention rate, very important for rankings. And so, I include this slide just to say they are thinking about all of these different factors. It's not just about admitting the best students or the most qualified students. It's about balancing all of these institutional priorities and really meeting the needs of the business, because colleges and universities are businesses, and they need to be solvent. They need to make good financial decisions, and they need to have a good experience for their students. So, another factor that they will use to manage some of these competing priorities and these expectations are predictive algorithms. So I mentioned earlier, time is really the enemy of the admissions office, especially with these ever increasing application pools. And so, Slate has a lot of really powerful qualities about it. And one of the things it can do is run these predictive algorithms where a school will look at all these different data points on an applicant's application and try to predict how likely are they to enroll here? How likely are they to be successful here? And here are some of the factors that they consider. You can see in the graphic. And they will, at the end of the day, I don't want you to think that it's all being run by computers. And at Florida, even with 60,000 applications, it was a human making the decision at the end of the day. But there were things that were, suggesting to us, okay, these are the pile of applicants that we think will not be admitted. These are the pile that we think will be admitted. And then, you had to go through and sort of approve or change the decision. So there is definitely, machine learning, AI aspects that are coming in heavily into play, especially because colleges aren't hiring more staff. So they're getting more applications, but they still have the same number of readers. They still have the same number of staff. And it is a very stressful job, I will tell you.
So let's shift over to impact of intended majors. So there are definitely colleges and universities, like liberal arts colleges, pretty much you apply to the college. Like you can indicate a major of interest, but it doesn't always have a huge impact on their decision to admit you or not. And then there are definitely universities where even if they have, colleges within the university, you can indicate a major if you want, but they're really looking at you holistically for admittance to the overall university. But then there are some schools that do evaluate you by college and by major. And there are some impacted majors. That's a term that the University of California system uses. So they have limits on majors. And then computer science and business at a lot of colleges, and engineering can be harder to get into. So sometimes they have prerequisites for what they expect to see on your college transcript in terms of math and science. And so it's really important for students to understand what those are. And be aware that, if you're applying to all of the, top 100 type computer science programs, that it's going to be very challenging to get in, and you have to make sure you have a balanced list. There are plenty of really great computer science programs outside of that profile. And so that's just something that's really important to keep in mind. We have noticed as a practice, and it gets talked about in our industry a lot, how, we have these really stellar young women who are interested in, say, biology. And that's one of the most popular majors in any college or university. And a lot of them have spent all their high school time doing science related things, so that they can tend to look a little bit alike. And, they end up doing fine. They get into amazing schools, but they might have their heart set on a handful, and maybe it doesn't work out because there's so many other people that look like them. So now that doesn't mean if you really are interested in biology, you should not apply for biology, because maybe you wouldn't be happy. Like sometimes people will say things like, oh, you should apply to public health instead. But if you're not interested in public health, that makes no sense. You would be better off at a school you get into that meets your needs, where you can study what you want. It's also, perfectly fine to enter college undecided. Most students will put a major in, and they might put undecided as their second choice. It's perfectly fine even to check undecided. And often you're asked a question about, like, if you're what is why did you list the major you listed in your application? What's the reason? And if you're undecided, tell us what areas you plan to explore. Because they want you, of course, they want you to have some ideas and be excited about some fields. But there's nothing wrong with being undecided. In fact, that's what most students are, even when they declare a major. You don't want to try to game the system. So, for example, people will say things like, oh, it'll be easier to get into the hospitality program at this particular selective university, and I'm not really interested in it, but I'm seeing it as a way in, and I'll switch my major later. But the problem with that is they're reading the application and you have no experience in that industry, and it's very clear to them what you're doing. So that can really backfire to try to game the system in that way. There might be some exceptions that a student tries a major and they, because there are some interests in it and that it is an easier entry major. That's a different thing. So, Laurel, thank you. I gave you the false alarm that I was
No problem.
that I was done with that slide. Go ahead.
Yeah. So, 3 words we really want you to keep in mind. So hopefully, this is not designed to scare you. I know it's a lot of information, and some of it can seem probably a little bit scary in terms of, well, there are all these factors and many of them are out of, our control. But actually, there are a lot of things that can be done really to have a really great experience in the college admissions process. So, as you're building a list, as you're working with your student to build a list, 3 words to keep in mind: fit, outcome, and value. And so often people are getting hung up on rankings as as a measure of quality, and it's kind of used as a shorthand. But really, rankings are very subjective. There's a lot of different things going on in them, and they're just not ultimately the best measure in our experience, and in many college pros experience. So there was a study done in 2018 at Stanford, and they looked at, how helpful are rankings in predicting how well a student will do in the future, both at college and in their life after. And what they found is that actually that's not what matters. It doesn't matter how good a school, quote unquote good, how highly ranked, I should say, a school that a student goes to. What matters is engagement. Is the student becoming engaged in their college experience? Are they finding things that are meaningful? Are they getting involved in experiential learning? Things like co-ops, internships? Are they doing research? Are they having a great social experience there? Because all of these factors are what lead to happiness ultimately with your college decision. And it's more important that you go to a school that may have a lower ranking if that's where you really want to be. It should be a place that feels like it fits you as a person, not just a student, but also as a person, that you are going to grow there emotionally, socially, and personally, and that because those are relationships that you're going to carry with you for the rest of your life. So, I really emphasize to students to please, when they make their lists, don't put any school on there just because they think they're going to get in. But also don't take a school off just because they think they're not going to get it. Don't focus on rankings and admissibility as the main points of evaluating whether it's a good personal fit for you. So just to illustrate this a little bit more, that outcome is not determined by ranking. We chose some of the alma maters of Fortune 500 CEOs. So these are people who are obviously pretty good at what they do and have been pretty successful in their careers. As you scan down this list, you'll probably notice pretty quickly there is not a huge representation from Ivy League or most selected universities in the country. There are, however, many who have gone on and gotten graduate degrees. And why I point that out is that in my experience working with students, I think it can be actually more important for a student to think about getting into, going to an undergrad institution where they can really, again, get very involved, have lots of great experiences, compile a strong record of research or internships if they want to go on and do graduate school in the future, because that allows them to really apply to some of those top tier institutions that at the graduate level can have a different, a big difference making in terms of the outcome in the future. So that's just something to consider. What's the long-term plan, and and what is the likelihood that a student will go on after undergrad and pursue another degree? Because that may change sort of some of the ways that you're thinking about the undergrad degree. I also wanted to give some examples of after college earnings. So I chose two schools that are they admit a pretty high percentage of students, about 50% each. So Stevens in Hoboken, New Jersey, right across the river from Manhattan, and Lehigh in Pennsylvania, just outside Philadelphia. And you'll notice both of these have very high after college earnings. These are some of the highest. On Niche is the website that I used to pull this data from. But the national average is about 33,000, which is, but they are exceeding that by more than $50,000. So it's just to think about, again, you don't have to be going to a school that admits 15 or less % of students in order to have a really good outcome down the road. All right, Joan. Oh, you're muted, Joan.
Gee, you'd think I would get this down by after 2 years of Zoom meetings. My goodness. Okay. But I want to reinforce what Laurel just said, is that, students, if they create a thoughtful list that, includes some of those aspirational schools, but not too many, because you don't want students to feel defeated if they don't get good news, but a really balanced list that's in line with who they are as a student, they're going to do fine. They're going to do really just fine. So what can you do? And this first point probably is more relevant to younger students watching this, but you choosing the most rigorous class schedule where you can still do well. And then, as Laurel pointed out earlier, demonstrate interest in the colleges on your list so that, visit if you can, if you can't visit, do the virtual sessions. If they don't require registration, make sure you add yourself to the mailing list, interview where possible. If they send you an email and you're interested in the school, open it. Now, I don't think that you need to advise your child to like go crazy, like on the website in an unnatural way, or, open every email. We're not saying that like they're tracking it to that nth degree, but, logically, if you're interested in the school and they send you emails and you never open them, that's probably not great, but they're not like super analyzing all this. So I don't want people to take away that it has to become a part-time job for your child to monitor their email from colleges. Again, engaging in activities, you don't have to do a million things, at grades in rigor of your curriculum in line with who you are as a student. Obviously, not every kid should be taking a lot of APs. That's not the right thing for them, and that's perfectly fine. But it isn't good to not get involved in activities. Getting involved is important, in doing things that are meaningful and making contributions to your school or community. It's really important to think about, what am I looking for in a college? And, we help our clients, think that through, and it can evolve a little bit over the year as the student, matures and also learns more. But that is going to be the guide to how is this college matching up to what I'm looking for. And Laurel went over a whole bunch of things related to outcomes. And, another factor that's huge is, students that have a mentor in college are much more likely to report a better college experience, but also better life experience. So, better career satisfaction with life. So, but not all the colleges that are necessarily the top ranked have mentoring cultures. Some do, some don't. So, so regardless of prestige or selectivity, you want to see, like, this is what I want. How does the school match up? It's really nice if students try not to fall in love with one school. You might end up choosing an early decision school. That doesn't necessarily mean you didn't like 4 or 5, so sometimes strategically, maybe you did like one school better, but you look at the data and you say, what, chances are I'm not going to get in there, but I really like school B just as much as school A. School A might have been a little bit more of a favorite. So, it probably makes more sense for me to do an early decision there. So, engage with your whole list. And, I'm just really reinforcing what Laurel said earlier about don't put a school on your list you won't attend, and don't give up on every difficult school. Throw a couple in there and see what happens if you're interested. So you can reach us at these email addresses, or you can book a consultation online with us. I hope this didn't cause more confusion, because I know we threw a lot of information at you, and we're happy to stay as long as necessary to answer any of your questions. So you can raise your hand, you can put it in the chat, you can unmute and ask, whatever works for all of you.